For an entire generation of children, one store was the closest thing to heaven on earth. It was called Toys R Us, and at its peak, it ran more than 1,500 stores around the world and sold well over $11 billion of toys a year. If you grew up in America or Britain or dozens of countries in between, this was the place your parents dreaded and you dreamed about. Aisle after aisle of bikes and dolls and video games stacked to the ceiling, watched over by a smiling cartoon giraffe named Geoffrey. It was so dominant that it helped drive nearly every rival toy shop in the country out of business. And then, in the space of a single year, it vanished. Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once. 700 stores went dark. More than 30,000 people lost their jobs. And here is the part almost nobody understands. Toys R Us was not killed by Amazon. It was not killed by Walmart. It was killed by a mountain of debt, $5 billion of it, loaded onto the company by the very people who were supposed to save it.
Take a seat. This meeting has one item on the agenda: how Toys R Us, the store that owned childhood itself, was buried alive under $5 billion of debt. Now, you have heard the easy version of this story. The internet killed it. Amazon killed it. The children grew up and stopped buying toys in stores. It is a tidy little tale, and it is almost entirely wrong. Toys R Us was still selling billions of dollars of toys the year it collapsed. It still had customers. It still had stores full of families. What it did not have was oxygen, because every dollar it earned was being swallowed to service a debt it never chose to take on. This is not a story about the future arriving. It is a story about what happens when a healthy company is bought, borrowed against, and slowly strangled by its own balance sheet. Watch closely, because the weapon that killed this giant is still perfectly legal, and it is still in use today.
The story begins in 1948, with a young man named Charles Lazarus and a single shop in Washington, D.C. At first he sold baby furniture, cribs and strollers for the families of the post-war baby boom. But customers kept asking the same question: "Do you sell toys?" Lazarus listened. He added toys, then more toys, and in 1957 he renamed the whole thing Toys R Us, with that famous backwards R, as if a child had scrawled it themselves. His big idea was simple but revolutionary. Instead of a small toy counter inside a department store, he built enormous warehouse-sized shops that sold nothing but toys, thousands upon thousands of them, at low prices, all year round. It was the birth of what retailers would later call the category killer, a store so big and so cheap in one single category that no smaller rival could survive next to it, and it worked spectacularly. Children were greeted by Geoffrey the Giraffe and a jingle that an entire generation still knows by heart. "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid." By the 1980s and 90s, Toys R Us was the undisputed king of toys, controlling a massive share of the entire American toy market. It grew into a global empire of stores, a flagship in Times Square with a giant Ferris wheel spinning inside it, and a brand so powerful that toy makers lived or died by whether Toys R Us chose to stock them. For decades, it looked unstoppable. But by the late 1990s, the ground was beginning to shift. Two enormous rivals had noticed how much money there was in toys. Walmart and Target began selling the most popular toys at rock-bottom prices, sometimes even at a loss, using them as bait to pull families into their stores to buy everything else. Toys R Us, which sold only toys, could not fight a war like that. Then came the internet. In the year 2000, Toys R Us made a fateful choice about the web. Rather than build its own online store, it signed a 10-year deal to become the exclusive toy seller on a fast-growing website called Amazon. On paper, it looked clever. In reality, it handed its most valuable digital future to its most dangerous future competitor. When Amazon later began letting other sellers offer toys too, Toys R Us sued and eventually won, but the damage was done. It had spent years pouring its online customers into Amazon's arms, teaching a generation to buy toys from the very company that would help bury it. By the time Toys R Us tried to build a serious website of its own, it was already years behind. The giant was being squeezed from every side at once, and it desperately needed money to modernize, to fix its tired stores, to build for the digital age. And that is exactly the moment the real disaster walked through the door.
Pause here, because this is where a struggling company became a doomed one. In 2005, Three of the biggest names in finance, the private equity firms KKR and Bain Capital, together with the property giant Vornado, bought Toys R Us in what is called a leveraged buyout. Remember that phrase, because it is the whole story. A leveraged buyout is when investors buy a company not mostly with their own money, but with borrowed money, and then place that debt onto the company they just bought. So Toys R Us was purchased for around $6.5 billion, and it woke up the next morning owing roughly $5 billion of debt that it had never asked for. The new owners promised to revive the giant. Instead, they had chained an anchor to its ankle and thrown it into the sea.
The numbers, once you see them, are almost cruel. That $5 billion of debt meant Toys R Us now had to pay around $400 million every single year just in interest before it paid a single employee or restocked a single shelf. $400 million a year, drained out of the company and handed to lenders, in the exact years it needed every cent to fight Amazon and Walmart. So the money that should have rebuilt the stores was gone. The money that should have built a great website was gone. The aisles grew shabby, the technology fell further behind, and shoppers began to notice. The tragedy is that Toys R Us was not failing to sell toys. In its final years, it was still bringing in more than $11 billion a year. A normal, unburdened company with those sales could have survived, even thrived. But Toys R Us was not normal. It was a healthy body carrying a parasite that consumed its blood faster than it could produce it. Year after year, the interest payments came due, the debt refused to shrink, and the walls closed in. The owners tried to refinance, to push the reckoning down the road, but eventually the road ran out. In September of 2017, Toys R Us filed for bankruptcy. At first, the company insisted this was a fresh start, a chance to shed its debt and reinvent itself for the modern world. Millions of parents still shopped there. The stores were still full during the holidays. But the debt was simply too vast, and the crucial Christmas season that followed came in below hopes. In March of 2018, the news broke that there would be no rescue. Toys R Us announced it would close or sell every one of its roughly 735 remaining stores in the United States. More than 30,000 workers, many of whom had given decades to the company, were told their jobs were ending, and at first they were offered no severance at all, while the financial firms behind the buyout had collected hundreds of millions in fees over the years. Only after a public outcry and a fight by the workers themselves was a $20 million hardship fund created. And in a final, heartbreaking twist, Charles Lazarus, the man who had built it all from a single furniture shop, died that same month, at the age of 94, just days after learning that the company he had spent his life creating was being liquidated. The Toys R Us name did not entirely vanish. The brand has been revived in small ways since. But the empire, the 1,500 stores, the childhood cathedral of toys, was gone. Not because children stopped dreaming, because the math would no longer allow the dream to exist.
Minutes recorded. Before we adjourn, one question for the room, and do leave your answer in the comments. Toys R Us did not die because it made a bad product. Children never stopped wanting toys. It died because it was bought, borrowed against, and bled dry by owners who risked very little of their own money and walked away far richer than the workers they left behind. The company earned the profits. The debt earned the punishment. So here is what I want you to sit with. When you hear that a great old company has been rescued by clever investors, ask the only question that matters. Rescued for whom? Because there is a kind of ruin that does not arrive as a fire or a flood or a rival with a better idea. It arrives quietly, in the fine print of a loan, signed by people who will never set foot in the store. Think on it. Next meeting, a failing little coffee bean shop, a young manager everyone ignored, and how being told no built one of the most valuable brands on earth. Starbucks. Subscribe. Attendance is taken.